The best way to improve your knowledge of a foreign language is to go and live among its speakers. The next best way is read extensively in it. That's what Christine Nuttall wrote back in 1996, and decades of research have proven her right. But what exactly is extensive reading, and why is it so effective? We look at the science behind it, explore the sweet spot rule that tells you exactly what level you should be reading at, discover the virtuous cycle that makes reading not just effective but actually enjoyable over time, and learn about Zipf's law, which should help you choose your material. What are common pitfalls and how can we implement practical strategies to make use of the best language learning method available to us? As Stephen Krashen, one of the most influential researchers in language acquisition, puts it, free voluntary reading may be the most powerful tool we have in language education. In fact, it appears too good to be true. Let's start by understanding what extensive reading actually is, and more importantly, what it isn't. When we talk about reading in language learning, there are 3 different levels we need to understand. The extensive reading foundation breaks it down like this. First, there's what they call reading pain. That's when you understand less than 90% of the words. At this stage, you are constantly reaching for the dictionary, you might get frustrated, and you are barely able to follow the story. If you're a beginner in a language, sometimes all the material can feel exactly like that. Then there's intensive reading. That's when you understand between 90 and 98% of the words. This is your typical textbook reading when you're exposed to new words, maybe you're even taking notes, and you're sort of actively studying the language. Here again, you might be opening the translator or dictionary frequently. It's useful, intensive reading is definitely useful, but it's not what we're talking about today. What we're interested in is extensive reading. According to the Extensive Reading Foundation, that means understanding 98% or more of the words. That means you encounter only 2 to 4 new words per page. And this seems to be where the magic happens. The READ acronym gives us a good guideline. Read quickly and enjoyably with adequate comprehension so you don't need a dictionary. This does, however, sound a little counterintuitive. Aren't we supposed to challenge ourselves with harder materials? Well, that's exactly what makes extensive reading to be too good to be true. There are countless studies that show all kinds of benefits, and we will quickly go through them next. Think about how you learned your native language. You didn't start by reading Shakespeare. You started with very simple stories, gradually building up your understanding. The same principle applies here. When you read material at your level, you're seeing vocabulary and grammar patterns in their natural context, over and over again. This repetition is crucial. Each time you encounter a word or pattern in different contexts, your brain strengthens its understanding. This is way more effective than memorizing word lists, and it happens subconsciously, which makes the whole prospect of extensive reading so appealing. You're not actively studying, you're just reading what you enjoy. So here it is, reading improves your reading skills. Thank you for watching. Alright, that's not shocking news. What's more interesting is that it enhances almost every aspect of language learning. Similar to the vocabulary exposure, your grammar improves because you're constantly seeing correct patterns that your brain picks up on. That way your writing gets better because you're internalizing how sentences are structured and what vocabulary to use in what context. But even your listening and, yes, speaking can improve from reading extensively through something called subvocalization. Ever notice that little voice in your head? Sometimes it can be annoying as hell, but when you read, it's at least focused on the text in front of you, hopefully. That's subvocalization. You're actually practicing pronunciation in your mind as you read. I've had this experience countless times where I used a phrase in English that I've never consciously studied. They just come naturally from all the reading I've done, since I've been reading pretty much only English books for the past 10 years or so. I'm currently in the process of switching everything from English to Spanish, following all the guidelines that I talk about in this video. Now, the sweet spot rule suggests that you should know 98% of the words when reading extensively. But from my experience, this rule is definitely a little bendable. I find 90 to 95% completely reasonable. Even when I encounter unknown words, I just often keep reading and completely ignore the fact that I don't understand said word, and therefore maybe not even understand the meaning of the sentence. However, that word will probably appear again, and then again and again, in different contexts, and eventually I will understand it. And if it doesn't appear again, well then maybe it wasn't that important for understanding the story anyway. So in my opinion, words don't have to click on the first encounter. There's also another practical reason why I'm not so strict about this 98% rule. And that is, finding material that exactly hits this sweet spot can be very challenging, especially as a beginner. If you don't have a basic vocabulary foundation, extensive reading can feel somewhat impossible. The rule and extensive reading in general becomes more and more important the more you progress in your language learning journey. So if you're a complete beginner, there are better ways to start. Comprehensible Input videos have two major advantages over reading when you're a beginner. First, the visual element makes content more easily understandable, even if you are far from the 98% vocabulary mark. You can grasp what's happening through context, gestures, and visual cues. Second, and this is crucial, you're listening to the language. Starting with listening can improve your pronunciation later on, because you develop an ear for how the language sounds. If you jump straight into reading, you might fall into the trap of doing subvocalization for everything you read in your native language's sound system, and therefore you might develop some bad pronunciation habits that are harder to fix later on. So subvocalization can kind of be amazing or a curse, depending on your level. You can circumvent that with books that you own both in written form as well as the audio version. That way you can listen and read at the same time or switch between the two, so maybe listen to one chapter first and then read it again later on in the day. So as you progress, I advise you to incorporate more and more reading. Another tip here is that comics, graphic novels and manga are great for this transition period. I read several volumes of One Piece in Spanish and it was noticeably easier than regular books because the images provided so much context. This made inferring word meanings much more natural and easier, and most importantly, it was just enjoyable. I can't stress this often enough. The best technique to learn a language is the one you actually do consistently and with joy, so that motivation becomes irrelevant. Compelling input appears to eliminate the need for motivation, a conscious desire to improve. When you get compelling input, you acquire whether you are interested in improving or not. For both the lower intermediate and upper intermediate level, you can use graded readers, which are books adapted to your level. And once you reach an advanced level, particularly if you're aiming to move from B2 to C1, to me, reading becomes almost non-negotiable. But at the same time, at this point, you also have access to so much more material. This brings us to the virtuous cycle of reading, a powerful feedback loop that makes the whole process self-sustaining. It works like this: the more you read, the better you understand. When you understand better, you can read faster. Reading faster makes the experience generally more enjoyable because you don't need to look up so much, which makes you want to read more, and so the cycle continues. It's really that simple. There is no crazy magic happening here. Each time you encounter a word again, you are closer to mastering it forever. The more you read, the more words you encounter and repeat naturally. This is why I built these exact principles into Lengia, my language learning app. The whole progress tracking and spaced repetition system is built on that fact. Whether you're reading the daily stories that match your interests and level, discovering new articles across the web, or uploading your own books, Lengia helps you simplify and translate everything to your level. You can track your progress, create quick flashcards, and maintain that immersive reading flow without constantly switching between different apps and dictionaries. But to keep this virtuous cycle going, there are some common pitfalls that we should avoid. I said that the sweet spot rule is bendable, but that doesn't change the fact that the biggest pitfall is choosing material that's too difficult. It's clearly the fastest way to break this virtuous circle, because if you're constantly struggling, reading becomes more of a chore than something enjoyable. Another common mistake is the dictionary trap. Even if the material is a bit harder than ideal, often it's better to keep reading and ignore words you don't understand. Remember, context is your friend, and words that matter will show up again. Checking the dictionary will just get you out of the flow of reading and immersion. If you want to do it, at least use a digital reading device like a Kindle or read on Lengia so you can check words quickly. I would recommend these digital tools anyway, because you can have hundreds of books with you, and the progress indicator is always a nice little bit of extra motivation, especially when you're just starting out. Like I said, motivation should be a non-factor once that virtuous cycle kicks in. Goodreads is one more resource I can recommend for finding new books and tracking your progress. The question what to read can also be answered by the perspective of Zipf's law. Zipf's law shows us that in any language, a small number of words make up the majority of what we actually use and read. The most common word in English, usually the, appears about twice as often as the second most common word, 3 times as often as the third most common word, and so on. In fact, just the 100 most frequent words typically make up about 50% of what we read, and the 1000 most frequent words cover roughly 85% of most texts. Why is this important for extensive reading? Once you learn those first 1000 most common words, you can understand the vast majority of any text. Each additional word you learn has less impact than the ones before, but by that point you are already understanding enough to enjoy reading. This also implies a second effect though. Encountering new words and then seeing them often enough gets increasingly more difficult. This leaves us with an interesting choice. Stick to one genre or not to do that. If you're into true crime stories, you will likely read several of them. That means you will see similar vocabulary repeated, but that's actually good. It helps reinforce those words. Once you're comfortable, then you can branch out to different genres for more varied vocabulary. If you, on the other hand, stick to the same niche forever, the density of new words will consistently decrease. Finally, don't feel guilty about dropping a book that you're not enjoying. Most of us feel like when we start a book, we should finish it and not give up. This is a really bad habit though. The only thing that matters is that you read. If a book doesn't excite you, just pick a different one, immediately. This is way better than procrastinating your reading because it became a chore. Extensive reading is of course not the only effective language learning method out there, and also not a one-size-fits-all. I am currently using very different approaches for Spanish and Japanese, and if you're curious about how to balance learning multiple languages at once, check out my latest video. I break down my complete strategy there, from managing daily routines to choosing the right resources for each language. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.